Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today on Digging for Truth, we're going to talk about a famous biblical king, King Belshazzar, who is famous for the account of the writing on the wall on the night Babylon fell to the Persians. ABR staff researcher and writer Bryan Windle has joined us again to walk through his life and do another archaeological biography. Well, Bryan, welcome back to Digging for Truth. It's good to see you up there in the Great White North.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always an honor to get together and talk with someone else who appreciates biblical archaeology.
Oh, man, appreciate that. That's both of us. It's an understatement, isn't it?
It is.
How excited and how much a rich treasure that God has given us to show us the reliability of his word. Well, speaking of that, we're going to be talking about a king from the book of Daniel, and this is one of my favorite subjects, Bryan. Let's dive right in. At one time, Belshazzar was unknown to history outside the Bible, but that's no longer the case. Let's get started.
Sure. Well, the Bible records in the book of Daniel that the night that Babylon fell to the armies of Cyrus the Great of Persia, that it was King Belshazzar who was ruling. And that very famous scene of them feasting and the writing on the wall coming and Daniel interpreting it for Belshazzar, that all happened. And as you mentioned, at one time, Belshazzar was unknown to history. Writers, ancient historians like Berosus and others seem to indicate that the last king of Babylon was Nabonidus. And so, of course, this led some critics in the early 19th century to doubt whether the book of Daniel was actually telling true and accurate history. In fact, one critic, César von Lengerke, described it as pure fiction and a palpable forgery. He goes on to say, quote, "The whole story is disfigured and falsified by the author, who was neither an eyewitness of the occurrences nor accurately acquainted with the history of him." Well, that all changed in the mid-19th century when we started to see Babylonian tablets being found and translated and published, and that all filled in the picture. It turns out that Belshazzar was a person, that he was the son of Nabonidus, that he served as co-regent. In fact, we now have over 3,000 cuneiform tablets from the reign of Nabonidus, many of them dating to the co-regency of Belshazzar. In fact, we now know more about Belshazzar and Nabonidus and their reign than we do about King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, because we actually don't have a lot from the latter part of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And so that's amazing for a guy who at one point people doubted he even existed. Now we know more about him than we do than one of the most famous kings of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's also amazing how our God sometimes makes rebellious sinners and men look absolutely foolish, and in this case, that's certainly the case. Let's review some of these documents, Bryan. We only got one show. We could probably do several shows on it, but let's start. Let's jump in and do some of the best ones, the highlights.
Sounds good. Yeah, when I started my research on this, it was like falling down a rabbit hole. There were just so many that I knew nothing about. The first ones I did know about. The most famous ones are 4 clay cylinders that were discovered in the ruins of the ziggurat at Ur in Iraq by J.E. Taylor. And they were 4 identical inscriptions, and they contained a prayer from Nabonidus that mentions his son Belshazzar. In it, he says, "Moreover, with regard to Belshazzar, my firstborn son, my own offspring, have the fear of your great divinity placed in his heart so that he does not commit any sin. May he be sated with happiness in life." So this is a prayer of Nabonidus to his gods that mentions Belshazzar, his son. But those aren't the only ones. In the years that followed, many more tablets were discovered. There's a letter in the Yale Babylonian collection that dates to the 7th year of Nabonidus. And in it, a man named Shemukin notes that he had a dream about this constellation. And he wants to give, he says, a favorable interpretation to, quote, "my lord Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, as well as to a favorable interpretation for my lord Belshazzar, the crown prince. We have another cuneiform tablet still from Borsippa, dated to the 11th year of Nabonidus, which mentions a slave of Belshazzar, the son of the king. There are 5 other Babylonian texts, all administrative texts that talk about Belshazzar, the son of the king. And so there just now are so many that the historicity of Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, is firmly established as being the son of Nabonidus.
It's excellent. It's a good survey. Now, Bryan, we have time in this segment to move to our next subject here, having to do with the co-regency with Belshazzar and Nabonidus. So tell us about that, if you would.
Yeah, because the question becomes, okay, fine, Nabonidus had a son named Belshazzar, but was he ever ruling as king? And the answer to that is the short answer is yes. He was co-regent with his father, and we know that because of a tablet that is known as the verse account of Nabonidus. Now, this is a poetic piece that was written by someone who is being critical of Nabonidus. And he notes that King left Babylon and he traveled into Arabia to a place called Tema, and that he was there for a long period of time. He was actually there for about a decade. And the reason for his leaving is unknown. The person who wrote the verse account of Nabonidus attributes it to madness. Other suggestions have been made. Maybe he was on an extended military campaign, or maybe he was seeking a better climate. But it states that, quote, he entrusted the army to his oldest son, his firstborn, the troops in the country he ordered under his command. He let everything go, and get this, he entrusted the kingship to him, that is to his firstborn, Belshazzar, and he himself went out for a long journey. And so we now have the fact that Belshazzar had the kingship entrusted to him by his father while he left for about a decade to live in Tema in Arabia.
It's great stuff, Bryan. Well, we're going to talk more about the co-regency in our next segment, and we will do that after this short break. We'll be right back. ABR is excited to announce the publication of Volume 2 from our excavations at Khirbet el-Makadr. The volume details archaeological remains from about 350 BC to the 8th century. This includes a New Testament village that may have been visited by Jesus. Over 400 pages of analysis, photos, and maps. You can pick up a copy today by visiting BibleArchaeology.org. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Bryan Windle today. We're talking about the archaeology surrounding King Belshazzar, who's mentioned, of course, in the book of Daniel, in the infamous handwriting on the wall scene. Really one of the greatest stories in the Bible. Okay, Bryan, so we kind of summarized in our first segment the fact that skeptical scholars in the 19th century didn't think that Belshazzar was a real ruler. Then they discovered, well, that doesn't work. The archaeology shows that's not the case. You mentioned the fact that he was given kingship. Some people have been picayune about, well, he's not called a king. Let's talk more about the co-regency, because there's more to share with the audience.
Well, that's right. Some people have pointed out that Belshazzar is never called king in any royal inscriptions during that period. And others have pointed out, and rightfully so, that the New Year festival was not held in Babylon while Nabonidus, his father, was away, because only the king could preside over the New Year festival. In the Babylonian Chronicles, it makes note that the New Year festival was not held. The New Year festival was not held because the king was away. So some have said, well, Belshazzar was not called a king. Okay, but he was a co-regent, his kingship was established, and there is another way to look at that, and that's that Belshazzar, while his father was away in Arabia, did things that only the king did. And so Paul-Alain Beaulieu has analyzed 38 datable Babylonian texts that refer to Belshazzar, and he's determined that he oversaw official matters in Babylon while his father was away from about the 4th year to about the 13th year of Nabonidus' reign. And specifically, there are 4 main things that Belshazzar did that only the kings did. So let's go through those. Number 1, the king of Babylon was the only person who had the honor of picking out the royal offerings of sheep and then was honored with the remains of the sacrificial meals that were offered to the cultic statues. And what we see is that during the period that Nabonidus, Belshazzar's father, was away in Arabia, that both Nabonidus and Belshazzar were honored in these ways. And so we see that he was honored as king in that particular way. Number 2, oaths were specifically sworn by the majesty of the king. And there is a record of oaths being sworn, not just by the majesty of Nabonidus, but also by the majesty of Belshazzar, while the latter was reigning in Babylon. And so we have oaths being sworn in the name of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Number 3, only the king was in command of the army of Babylon. And according to the verse account of Nabonidus, Nabonidus gave his son Belshazzar the command of the army of all the lands, it says. In the Babylonian Chronicle, the armies of Akkad, that's the armies of Babylon, are called his army, referring to Belshazzar. And so we have another thing where Belshazzar is essentially acting as king. And the fourth is that records clearly show that Belshazzar was exercising full royal authority while he was in Babylon. He was granting land leases. He was ordering that temples would be purified. He was issuing directives, quote, by the command of Belshazzar. And so Billeux notes that during Nabonidus' absence, Belshazzar assumed the regency, and it appears that the king never intervened in the internal affairs of Babylon while he himself was reigning in Tema. So for all intents and purposes, there were 2 kings reigning in Babylon at this period. Nabonidus, who was reigning from Tema, and Belshazzar, who was reigning in Babylon. So while it's true that Belshazzar was never called king in any official royal inscriptions, the records indicate that Belshazzar was entrusted with the kingship, and they indicate that he did a number of duties. He was essentially reigning as the de facto king of Babylon. Now, given his position as co-regent and given all the things that he was doing, those roles, those official royal duties as king, it would not be surprising that people would refer to him as king while addressing him face to face, as we see in Daniel 5:18. Moreover, this all makes sense of the king's reward that he offers to Daniel if Daniel will translate the handwriting on the wall for him. He's offered the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. That's the highest he could offer because his father was king and he was co-regent.
That's fantastic, Brian. You know, it's so interesting. First, that last point you make shows the eyewitness nature of the authorship of Daniel in the 6th century. There, knowing the political structure of the situation there. That's an important point for us to point out. You know, this almost reminds me. The skepticism reminds me of Jesus never said that he was God, except that everywhere imprinted on the New Testament are things like, the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins. Before Abraham was born, I am. So he doesn't come out and say this narrow definition that somebody imposes on it, but it's everywhere. It's so interesting. And you're saying the same thing here. He's not called king, but it's everywhere. Right. Really remarkable. Now, speaking of Daniel 5:18, Brian, there is a reference here. Daniel tells Belshazzar, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship. So that would seem on the surface to imply there's some kind of relationship there. Tell us about that. It's a very interesting reference and statement.
Yeah, and that's an important point because the critic who I mentioned at the beginning, von Larenki, he makes a big point of the fact that Belshazzar there's no record that there was a Belshazzar who was ever son of Nebuchadnezzar, and so we can't say that. Now, here's the thing. We know that Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, had no royal ties. Nabonidus in his own inscriptions tells us who his father was, tells us who his mother was. They were not related to Nebuchadnezzar. Berosus, the historian, records that Nabonidus came to the throne through a coup, and so he was not of royal blood. So it could be that Daniel, when he talks about Nebuchadnezzar, your father, is using it in the sense that it was father and son were sometimes used in the ancient Near East to mean predecessor or successor. And maybe the most famous of which is on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, where Shalmaneser records a tribute from Jehu, son of Omri. Well, Jehu was no relation to Omri. In fact, Jehu had killed the entire line of Omri, but he was known as his son. That's just a successor. But other scholars have pointed out that Belshazzar may have been related to Nebuchadnezzar through his mother. And according to Herodotus, Nabonidus has had a wife named Nitocris, and former Yale University professor Raymond Philip Dougherty has presented an extensive list in his book on Belshazzar of circumstantial evidence that's quite plausible that Nitocris was Nebuchadnezzar's was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar by an Egyptian wife. Nitocris is an Egyptian name. And so if this is the case, then Nebuchadnezzar's daughter was Belshazzar's mother, and so Daniel's phrase, Nebuchadnezzar your father, may have been used in a familiar sense. Any way you look at it, there is a valid explanation for that phrase.
Yeah, so you have two scenarios. Daniel is familiar with ancient Near Eastern ways of expressing king relationships. At the minimum, father, meaning not biological father. If, in fact, it's true that this biological relationship was there, that's more evidence that Daniel's a contemporary witness, because no one could have possibly known this. And a lot of people say that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC in Israel, and there's just no way that the author could have had this information at that time. So really remarkable stuff that you've dug up here, Bryan. Well, I'll let you comment on that some more when we come back for our next break.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. We're here with Bryan Windle. We're talking about King Belshazzar. All right, Bryan, last segment, any final comments about, the historicity here of Daniel's eyewitness?
Yeah, you mentioned that this theory that the book of Daniel was not written by Daniel, but was written much later in the 2nd century in Israel. I think the fact that there are copies of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls that date to the 2nd century pretty much puts a nail in the coffin, for me anyways, of that particular theory. There's not enough time for it to be written and then widely distributed like it apparently was. Not to mention, as you mentioned, all of these details that it gets right that someone writing much later would not have known about Babylonian history.
Yeah, and that conflict is largely because of Daniel's prophetic visions of future kingdoms. You have to put it later if you don't believe in a God that knows the future and sees it. Okay, so let's now shift to the fall of the Babylonian Empire to the Persian army and the death of Belshazzar.
Sounds good. Well, that is Daniel chapter 5. According to the Bible, the night that Babylon fell to the armies of Persia, Belshazzar and his court were feasting, and they intentionally blasphemed Yahweh, the one true God of the Israelites, by having some of the vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem come and using them for their toasts. And a supernatural hand appears, that writing on the wall scene that's very famous. Daniel's called to interpret it, and he proclaims the downfall of Belshazzar. And the chapter ends just with a simple state of the fall of the city and says that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Now, we actually have multiple historians, ancient historians, who wrote about the fall of Babylon. And it's very interesting to see how they all relate together with what the Bible says. So we're going to leave aside the supernatural handwriting on the wall for a minute. And the reason for that is that we're talking about archaeology, and archaeology by definition cannot verify or falsify supernatural events. So just a couple of things. Xenophon, in his history, notes that the Babylonians were not concerned about Cyrus's siege because they, quote, believed they had provisions enough for more than 20 years. And he also records that they were, quote, celebrating a certain festival during which all Babylon was accustomed to drink and revel all night long. Herodotus also mentions that the Babylonians were dancing and celebrating a holiday which happened to fall then. Now, we don't know exactly what holiday this was. It wasn't the New Year holiday, though, because that falls in March, April, and Babylon fell in October of 539 BC. But isn't it interesting that we have the Bible talking about a feast, we have Xenophon talking about a feast, we have Herodotus talking about a feast, all the night that Babylon fell?
Yeah, it's just, again, the eyewitness nature of this stuff is just remarkable. It's just so exciting. And we have other witnesses outside the Bible that get this right. Okay, so, but we got more about this. We got some stuff from the Nabonidus Chronicle. There's more to talk about, believe it or not.
Yeah, and so we're going to talk about the actual fall of Babylon and where Nabonidus was and where Belshazzar was. We have ancient historians that tell us that Nabonidus had marched out with the army of Babylon to meet the army of Persia. So the Nabonidus Chronicle records, quote, when Cyrus did battle at Opis on the bank of the Tigris against the army of Akkad, that's Babylon, the people of Akkad retreated. He carried off plunder, slaughtered the people, and on the 14th day, Sippar was captured without battle. Nabonidus fled. On the 16th day, Ugburu, the governor of Gutium, and the army of Cyrus, without battle, entered Babylon. Afterwards, Nabonidus retreated. He was captured at Babylon. And another scholar translates that last line as, afterward, Nabonidus, when he returned to Babylon, was taken prisoner. Then we have Berosus. Berosus says, on learning of the invasion of Cyrus and his army, Nabonidus met him with his army and opposed him in battle. After being defeated, he fled with a small retinue and took refuge in the city of the Borsippians, with its Borsippa. Cyrus, meanwhile, seized Babylon. Cyrus marched on Borsippa to lay siege to Nabonidus. Nabonidus, however, did not wait the siege, but surrendered himself at first. Dealing with him in a gracious manner, Cyrus granted him Carmenia as his residence and sent him out of Babylonia. Now, as we reconstruct the chain of events that led to this swift and chaotic fall of Babylon, it's really important to note a couple of things. Here's what happened. Cyrus invades the land. Nabonidus leaves Babylon to go and meet him in battle. He leaves, presumably, Belshazzar as king reigning in Babylon as the co-regent at this time. And so after defeats at Opis and Sippar, Nabonidus flees to Borsippa. In the meantime, Babylon falls without a major battle, and then Nabonidus surrenders. Either he's taken back to Babylon as prisoner, or he returned to Babylon to officially give himself up. And then Cyrus graciously gave Nabonidus a chance to leave, to go into exile, where he lived out his life in Carmenia. Here's the thing. The most important thing to point out is that all of the ancient histories, biblical or secular, all agree on one point. Nabonidus was not in Babylon the night it fell. He was probably under siege at Borsippa. And so the king who was reigning in Babylon that night was Belshazzar, like the Bible says. Moreover, Xenophon records that the king of Babylon was killed that night. Now, some people have pointed out and said, no, there's a discrepancy. You can't trust Xenophon because we're told elsewhere that Nabonidus was kind to, that Cyrus was kind to Nabonidus and he didn't die. But that's not an accurate representation. Xenophon doesn't say it was Nabonidus who was killed. It says the king of Babylon was killed. And this is all in agreement. The king of Babylon, Belshazzar, was killed, just like the Bible says. And the verse account of Nabonidus is true as well. Cyrus was kind to Nabonidus and let him leave into exile. And so it all fits together.
Well, Bryan, we have done just a tour de force here. We got to get off the treadmill. There's so much stuff that we can be excited about the King Belshazzar and his relationship to the historicity of the ancient Near East, the Bible, and so forth. Thanks for digging into all this. Quite a number of things that I had never heard before that only strengthen my own convictions about Daniel, and I appreciate all that you do, brother.
Thanks so much for having me, Henry.
All right, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We can trust the book of Daniel. We can trust that its prophecies looking into the future are true and were written in the 6th century, which points us to the divine origin of Holy Scripture. And this is a powerful piece of evidence that the Bible does actually come from the one and true living God. We hope you've been encouraged by this today, and we thank you for supporting us, praying for us, and watching Digging for Truth.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.